Like a lot of Arkansans, I grew up in a pretty rural area. My hometown's about 65 miles northeast of Little Rock, and it had a population of right around 600 people. The tallest building was probably the gym at the high school. So my earliest exposure to urban architecture came from the media, and since I was a kid, that usually meant anime and other cartoons. And since I was a strange kid, late 90s TV shows like Frasier. These buildings didn't exist in the world that I knew. Even going into Little Rock, I never really saw anything that I thought looked like this. All the buildings that I saw were big office buildings. Then I started having to go to a podiatrist in North Little Rock, and every time I went, I noticed this building just down the street. To me, a young kid who had grown up watching Digimon, it looked just like I imagined the apartment buildings in that show. And those were as unreal to me as Castle Grayskull or the Fortress of Solitude. I was absolutely mesmerized by this building, and I didn't know it then, but as I grew older, I began to realize that the design of that building, from its glass panels to the odd angles of its ground level, and just everything about it, was indicative of a larger style of architecture, modern architecture. To this day, I'm still drawn in by modern architecture. It triggers something nostalgic in me. Memories of my childhood and the daydreams I would have about the lives of people who seemed so foreign to me. People who seemed so exciting and high class and 1,000 leagues removed from my life in rural North Arkansas. Modern architecture can be found all over the state of Arkansas, and it comes in many different styles. So today, I would like to take some time to share my love of it with all of you. And who knows, maybe it'll trigger your nostalgia switch too. Modern architecture was an architectural movement that emerged in the first half of the 20th century and became dominant after World War II before gradually fading out in the 1980s. It was based on new and innovative technological developments in the field of construction. Those developments included things like massive sheets of glass made in a process invented in 1848, which allowed the manufacture of very large windows. Thanks to the introduction of the Bessemer process in the 1850s, steel became an inexpensive material. As it was lighter and easier to work with than materials like iron, architects had more ability to play with steel and create larger buildings. The first steel-frame skyscraper, the 10-story Home Insurance Building in Chicago, was built in 1884. Combining steel with Portland cement created reinforced concrete, first showcased in 1867. All of these things worked in concert to allow new styles of construction and design to bloom. With steel and reinforced concrete supporting buildings, architects were able to use more wall space for windows, and concepts like curtain walls, which is when glass spans from floor to floor, were introduced. In situations where builders wanted to hide reinforced concrete floor slabs, they could turn to a product called spandrel glass, which was an opaque glass created by fusing a thin layer of sometimes colored ceramic to the exposed surface of the glass. Modern architecture also brought important philosophical changes. Among them, a rejection of ornamentation and an embrace of minimalism. The days of the fluted column were gone. Architects lived and died by the credo attributed to Louis Sullivan: form ever follows function. They believed that the exterior of a building should reflect the function of the interior. A library should look like a library, a bank like a bank, a school like a school, and so on. Modern architects also believed in the honesty of their constructions, which is to say that they didn't believe that a building should be made from steel and then covered with stone so that it appeared to be a large stone building. If a building was made of steel, there was no harm in showing the steel or the glass or the concrete or the beams of the roof or the shape of the elevator shaft. It was like the body positivity movement of architecture. Now, there are many different genres of modern architecture. I'm going to walk us through the major ones, providing some examples of that style from around the world, as well as right here in Arkansas, including the names of some architects that you may recognize. Prairie School was a style of architecture that developed in the 1890s and remained popular through the 1920s, and was most common in the Midwestern United States. It was characterized by horizontal lines, including flat or hipped roofs with overhanging eaves and windows grouped in horizontal bands. Architects of the Prairie School, like Frank Lloyd Wright and Fay Jones, believed that it was important for the architecture of the structure to reflect and work alongside its natural environment. The horizontal lines were meant to evoke and relate to the wide, flat, and open expanses of the Midwestern prairies of states like Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. This style is also sometimes known as Wrightian, or the Chicago group, as many of the architects most associated with this style either studied or practiced architecture in Chicagoland. Around the time that the Prairie School was winding down in the United States, the Bauhaus movement was starting to rock and roll over in Europe. This is a primary European style, so I don't have examples from Arkansas, but it will influence styles that come later, so I thought that it was relevant to go ahead and include it here. Bauhaus comes from the Bauhaus School, which was a German art school in operation between 1919 and 1933. The school and its founders, including Walter Gropius, were trendsetters in that they combined crafts or applied arts with fine arts, and attempted to unify the principles of mass production with individual artistic vision, to combine aesthetics with everyday function. Sort of like saying that just because we're going to make 10 million pins doesn't mean we shouldn't take some time to think about the design of that pin. The international style gained popularity in the 1920s and continues to be influential in architecture to this day. It was the first movement in modern architecture to really embrace functionality, simple forms, clean lines, and open spaces. It emerged in concert with Bauhaus, but rather than being a new style for Europe, it sought to be a new global style. Architects designed buildings with the idea that they would be universal, that you could put an international style building anywhere from Little Rock to London, Texarkana to Tokyo, Jonesboro to Johannesburg, and it would fit just the same. The buildings don't reflect an established cultural history and were an active attempt to buck against the Beaux-Arts style. It was also a utopian style. Architects of the international style sought a standard for architecture based on ideals of an equal society in which the building didn't reflect any sort of class distinction. While the style was international, it did emerge from the Netherlands, France, and Germany after World War II, thanks to architects like Le Corbusier, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and Marcel Breuer. It became the dominant style around the world for several decades, and many iconic American buildings, including those built by Bangladeshi American architect Fazlur Rahman Khan, exhibit the international style. International style structures placed an emphasis on the use of lightweight, mass-produced industrial material, and rejected all ornamentation and a lot of color. It features repetitive modular forms and the use of flat surfaces, often seeming to be layered with glass. Among Arkansas architects, this is perhaps best exhibited in the work of Irvin McDaniel Jr., who learned architecture from fellow prisoners in a German POW camp during World War II and later worked alongside his father in Hot Springs, designing many buildings around the city. More on that in the podcast. As well as Warren Seagraves. Streamline Modern is also known as Art Modern or Ocean Liner style for reasons that only make sense to the French. and it emerged from the earlier Art Deco style, with which it's often confused. It was inspired by aerodynamic design and emphasized curving forms, long horizontal lines, and sometimes even some nautical elements. I guess that's where ocean liner style comes from. Anyways, Streamline Modern emerged in the late 1920s and stuck around until the 1950s. Unlike Art Deco, which has intricate ornamentation, Streamline Modern is fairly plain, focusing more on broad geometric designs. Not only was Streamline Modern favored by architects hoping to evoke a sense of forward-thinking modernity, it was utilized by many industrial designers to give the impression of sleekness and speed. Streamline Modern is really the style most evocative of the jet age in immediate post-war America. PWA Modern is the style of 1,000 names, also known as WPA Modern, Federal Modern, Depression Modern, and Classical Modern. Buildings of this style were built in the United States between 1933 and 1944, a time that you might recognize as the Great Depression. PWA Modern was a style born not from academia, but from workers. These buildings were constructed as part of relief efforts sponsored by the Public Works Administration and Works Progress Administration. It drew from traditional motifs such as those found in the Beaux-Arts and Art Deco styles, but lacked a lot of the ornamentation, making it, in a way, similar to Streamline Modern. Unlike a lot of the modern styles, PWA Modern was rather conservative, but it more than made up for that by being monumental. These buildings are usually public buildings like courthouses, post offices, museums, and athletic facilities. Remember back at the beginning when I said that one of the focuses of modern architecture was that the structure should reflect what happens inside the structure? PWA Modern did that very well. These buildings conveyed a sense of authority and austerity. Many of the buildings of this style in Arkansas were designed under the authority of Chief Engineer for the state, George Trapp. So if PWA Modern took Streamline Modern and made it more formal, Googie did the opposite. While Streamline Modern was the style of the jet age, Googie was the style of the space age and the atomic age. It originated in Southern California in the 1930s as a sort of cartoonish exaggeration of Streamline Modern. It is sometimes known as Populux or doo-wop, and was especially popular among motels, coffee houses, and gas stations, going hand in hand with the spread of car culture. It was characterized by upswept or butterfly roofs. It was curvaceous and made bold use of geometric shapes as well as glass, steel, and neon. Structures used designs symbolic of motion, like boomerangs, flying saucers, diagrammatic atoms and parabolas, and starbursts. A master of this style was the Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen. But many of the designers of this style went unrecorded because it wasn't a high art style, but very commercial. Today, Googie structures are being destroyed left and right because they don't fit the current aesthetic, or they're found in small towns that the interstate system made obsolete. But the styles had a lasting impact on pop culture. The Jetsons and Disney's Tomorrowland were created toward the end of the Googie style and drew heavily from them. It's still around today, though, in media seeking to evoke a sense of retrofuturism, like Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, the Powerpuff Girls, Futurama, Jimmy Neutron, The Incredibles, and the Fallout series of video games. Honestly, Googie architecture is one of my deepest and strangest loves, and I really blame Fallout 3 for making that 10 times worse. Mid-century modern architecture encompasses elements of many any of these styles, but is a bit of a beast unto itself. Some have called it the manifestation of the future with no thoughts of the past. And there is an innate sense of optimism in mid-century modern design. It emerged in the United States after World War II, which has been characterized as a time when the country came of age. We were a youngish nation without the heavy baggage of centuries of tradition and history, and we were suddenly the global superpower. So we started to enjoy ourselves and play around with new technology. It utilizes clean and simple lines and an honest use of materials, generally without decorative embellishments. It is in some ways an American reflection of the International and Bauhaus styles, but was slightly more organic in form and less formal. A lot of that came from Scandinavian and Brazilian architects, like Oscar Niemeyer, who valued clean simplicity and the integration of the building with nature. Mid-century modernism is the architectural style of the American suburbs, and is found in residential neighborhoods in cities like Little Rock, Fort Smith, Fayetteville, and Hot Springs. And that was the intent. Mid-century modern architecture was designed to be accessible in order to bring modern architecture to the masses. Architects working in this style, including Noland Blass Jr. and Elmer A. Stuck here in Arkansas, intended to open up interior spaces and bring the outdoors in with ample windows and open floor plans. Mid-century modernism went beyond simple structures and included the things that went into these homes, like furniture. I bring this up entirely so that I can talk about the Fraser chair. I love this chair so much. It was designed by husband and wife team Charles and Ray Eames, and it is actually called the Eames Lounge Chair. They intended for it to resemble a well-used first baseman's mitt, and I could make the Fraser veneer reference that I used in the Arkansas vernacular architecture video, but instead I'm just going to point out that Charles and Ray Eames also designed these chairs, and I think they're pretty much the opposite of the Eames lounge chair in terms of things that I would like to spend a long time sitting in. Brutalism might seem like the opposite of mid-century modernism, and, well, it came from a place that had quite a different experience during World War II, so that does make sense. Brutalism emerged during the 50s in the UK among post-war reconstruction. It was minimalist and showcased bare building materials and emphasized structural elements over decorative design. Brutalism is characterized by exposed, unpainted concrete or brick, angular geometric shapes, and a predominantly monochrome color palette. It was often used for institutional buildings and low-cost social housing, which is part of the reason that Brutalism went out of style in the 1970s. It was heavily associated with urban decay and a sort of Orwellian governmental air. However, it did make a trip across the Atlantic to the United States, and architects like I.M. Pei and Philip Johnson had some interesting interpretations of the style. Some of them went over fairly well, while others were, well, maybe we shouldn't talk about that. The last style that I want to discuss is New Formalism, which emerged in the 1950s in the US and really flourished in the 60s. This style exhibited many classical elements that were simply more stylized to better fit the modern aesthetic. It utilized luxurious materials, often set buildings on a podium, was monumental, featured smooth walls and delicate details, and sat amidst a formal landscape. A couple architects said to be the fathers of this style are Minoru Yamasaki and Arkansan Edward Durrell Stone. I want to take just a moment to discuss Stone because I don't think enough people from Arkansas realize the impact that an Arkansan has had on the world of architecture. Edward Durrell Stone, a man born and raised in Fayetteville, Arkansas, designed buildings that I can almost guarantee that you've seen at least pictures or video of, and if not, you're about to. The House of the President of Pakistan, the General Motors Building in New York City, North Carolina's State Legislative Building, Florida's new Capitol Building, the tall one in the back, not the one in the front, the second Bush Stadium, the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, and the United States Embassy in New Delhi, India, a building that Frank Lloyd Wright once said was the only embassy that does credit to the United States. Exemplifying the formal landscape aspect was his work on the Pine Bluff Civic Center, where Edward Durrell Stone designed the structure and his son Edward Jr. designed the landscape. Today, we're at a serious risk of losing a whole lot of modern architecture, and there are lots of reasons why. A big reason is that it's really hard for a lot of us to understand these buildings in historical context. Some of them don't seem to fit with the time that they were built, so we don't even realize that they're approaching 100 years old. It's also a style that's very close to us in our day-to-day lives, and when you're around something all the time, you sometimes forget that it isn't just a boring office building or an old hotel on the edge of town. It's easy for us to look at buildings like the Old State House or the Capitol Hotel with their flourish and classical stylings and say, that's history, that's architecture, that's art. But it's hard for us to do the same with, say, a fire station in Fayetteville or a garage in Rose City. For us to be able to preserve this time period in American architectural history, we have to be willing to break down our deeply ingrained understanding of what is and isn't history, to question the difference between an ordinary building and architecture. Not everyone's going to get it, but not everyone gets Cubism either, and we still preserve Picasso's, don't we? Nevertheless, we will lose many of these structures along the way. The modern buildings were themselves built on plots of land once occupied by neoclassical and Romanesque buildings. That's just how life goes. And modern design continues to live on through contemporary building design. There's still a big focus on open spaces and clean lines. Many of the buildings in Little Rock reflect those concepts first shown in genres of modernism. The international style of Kahn's 1974 clustered tube Sears Tower in the Simmons Tower, built in 1986. Union Plaza, built in 1968, actually predates the 1970 and 71 1 and 2 World Trade designed by Yamasaki, and reflects the new formalism style of those structures. And closer to home, the newer Simmons building, constructed in 2003 as the Axiom building, is evocative of the lines and layout of Little Rock's first skyscraper, the Tower building. And one that I just happened to notice this afternoon is the AP&L building and the Clinton Library, separated by several decades, but they have a lot of looks in common. These all showed that echoes of the architectural revolt of the 20th century still rings in the ears of contemporary architects. This has been Mapsternaut. Thank you for watching.